Lynching is generally understood to be one of the most shameful practices in all of American history, and it is widely promoted as an expression of white hatred for black culture, having no reasonable basis in a lawful society. However, when this contentious part of our common history is objectively researched, without the attendant academic animus often leveled against mainstream American society, the resulting evidence portrays a system of justice that was not, in all respects, inferior to the one we have today. There is uncertainty about the origin of the term itself, but Professor Dwight Murphy of Wichita State University believes it originated from a certain Colonel Charles Lynch of Bedford County, Virginia, who administered local justice during the American Revolution. British loyalists had been stealing horses for the Redcoats throughout the region, and the nearest high court was some 200 miles away in Williamsburg. So, Colonel Lynch took it upon himself to try and execute the offenders. After the Revolution, his actions were legalized by the state legislature, and his name became synonymous with this form of ad hoc execution. In recent decades, lynching has become such a powerful symbol of white racism that it has been largely forgotten that whites too were hanged without trial. Statistics are difficult to gather, and each incident requires careful scrutiny. But during the 20-year height of the lynching era, from 1882 to 1903, some 3,337 lynchings occurred. Of this number, 1,169 were white, 108 were unknown or non-white, and some 2,060 were black. Whites constituted about one-third of the total on paper, but this number is likely much higher, as vast numbers of unreported lynchings occurred on the western frontier, where white pioneers, gold rush men, and cattle barons fought for space and livelihood. It is also quite easy to lose sight of another vital aspect to lynching, that it was by no means a random killing, but punishment for a very specific crime. Due to the localized nature of American culture back then, many participants knew the accused and could often determine his guilt. Even opponents of lynching rarely argued that the victims were innocent, only that the courts, rather than mobs, should enforce the law. Lynchings also reflected the will of the community, often being advertised in advance in newspapers, attracting thousands of people from neighboring areas. For example, in 1881, in Wyoming, Dr. John E. Osborne, a future Democratic governor of the state, helped hang the notorious bandit George Parrott before a large gathering of people. He even skinned the corpse himself. The hide was then tanned and made into a medical instruments bag, a pair of dress shoes, and a tobacco pouch. In the majority of cases, citizens resorted to lynching because the competent legal authorities were days or weeks away by horseback, and the nature of the crimes committed required that justice could brook no delay. Even President Andrew Jackson himself sanctioned the practice when he recommended to Iowa settlers that they lynch murderers on the spot. Likewise in Kansas, a New York Tribune correspondent reported in 1858 that there was a general public disposition to pass over useless forms of territorial law and corrupt federal courts, and simply try and execute the criminals where they stood. It is interesting to note that blacks also formed lynch gangs when needed. In Clarksdale, Tennessee, blacks lynched a white man in 1914 for raping a black woman. The authorities later ruled that this was a justifiable homicide and dropped all charges against the mob leaders. If race were the primary motive in lynchings, and in some cases this was manifestly evident, we would expect blacks in the Old South to have been more likely to suffer from it than those who lived elsewhere. However, the numbers indicate otherwise. During the 1890s, for example, blacks living in Mississippi were no more likely to be lynched than those living in Kansas. So, how did lynching compare to our current system of criminal justice? Obviously, the potential for racial sadism and blatant error were grim, abiding defects, and by today's social orthodoxy, it was pure barbarism, for its purpose was punishment and deterrence by example. It did not pretend to be anything else. Furthermore, something gets lost in any system where big government, rather than the immediate community, punishes criminals. In lynching, there was immediacy, finality, and in many cases direct participation. The victim or the bereaved could take personal vengeance. Primitive as this was, and subject to whim and cruelty, it answered a deeply felt human need. Clearly, any form of vigilantism can cause serious injury to local social stability and trust, but the laws must reflect the community's sense of justice, and in this respect our current system often fails. Known criminals are released on technicalities or for politically motivated reasons, and executions are carried out years after the crime, often seeming unrelated to it. Innocent men were undoubtedly lynched, and this is a great tragedy. However, were these deaths any more tragic than today's routine killings in a society that has been made more violent by an increasingly impotent, highly politicized legal system? One day we will come to terms with our history, and perhaps rue that it is gone, for in the very near future, we shall be witness to a broken, hostile judicial apparatus with genocide on its mind, and this time, it will not be colorblind.